Mr. Bungle. That name might strike a chord with some of you, but most likely probably not. The creative genius of this band, stemming from a trilogy of albums in the 90s, has gone somewhat unappreciated by the general masses. And today, we're here to analyze and shine some light onto the work of Mr. Bungle.
To the obnoxious
on the radio,
Mr. Bungle.
Yo, boy.
Anybody want to introduce themselves? Patton?
No.
You guys gonna stand in the corner and pout?
Hans, 18. I play drum.
He's Hans' drum solo.
Yo.
We're all horror, Halloween, Star Wars, action figure, porno freaks.
You just had to say that, didn't you? Oh yeah, Mike, you're not coming over. Okay, let's try this.
Coming over now, coming over.
Yeah.
So what makes them so genius, so great? Well, let's take a closer look at what people consider to be their main run of albums. Well, actually, we have to go back even further to 1985, when the band first formed in some lonely northwestern corner of California, that being Eureka. Still in high school, the band originally consisted of Mike Patton, Trace Pruance, Trevor Dunn, Theo Lengel, and Jed Watts. From 1985 to 1989, they'd release a multitude of demos documenting their transformation musically from a metal band with funk elements to a funk band with metal elements. They'd also swap out the drummer twice, ending up with Danny Heifetz and another member, Clinton McKinnon. And by then, they were armed to the teeth with talent. Pretty much every single member was a multi-instrumentalist and extremely talented for high schoolers. But alas, high school bands like Mr. Bungle can have so much potential but not really get off the ground. They got some notice around the US and internationally, but overall, it wasn't that huge of an influence. However, Mike Patton later attended a Faith No More gig and got added into the group as a lead vocalist thanks to, guess what, a Mr. Bungle tape. Mike Patton getting signed to Faith No More changed everything. Not only did he give the voice for Faith No More and help aid them into the national spotlight with albums like The Real Thing and Angel Dust, but this also aided Mr. Bungle, with some sneaky promotion, allowing them to finally see some proper success in getting them signed to Warner Brothers, which came as a shock to everyone. Well, why did they get signed to Warner Bros? After all, their demo sounded like this. So why would Warner Brothers sign something as childish and immature as Mr. Bungle? Well, Faith No More's success caught the eyes of Warner Brothers, and they wanted to make sure more money from the now up-and-coming talent of Mike Patton could be made. So they just let Mike and Mr. Bungle go completely nuts in the studio, and they went nuts.
Say, no, but mine. You know what a Mr. Bungle is?
Why no?
A Mr. Bungle is...
Mr. Bungle's first official album, their debut, Mr. Bungle, came out on August 13th of 1991, and it is a freak show. Right off the bat, you can see a lot of the songs are official studio versions of previous songs appearing on their demos, and you can spot just how much an actual studio and time allowed their music to flourish. This was in no small part thanks to having John Zorn, legendary avant-garde jazz producer, producing this album. Hear the difference.
From the inside over, incubated by the heat of fear and love, the cells coagulated. Egg. 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 Rotting from the inside over, incubated by the heat of fear and love, the cells coagulated. Egg. Egg.
Re-recordings or not, this album is hard to encapsulate in some small words, so let's break it down. First off, the actual content. What's the style of music they play? Well, as I said earlier, it's mostly described by critics as funk metal, but it's not just funk and metal. Elements of jazz, avant-garde, electronica, rock, carnival music, and even bits and pieces of hip-hop are found. It's a walking Frankenstein, an ever-shifting fractal of music packaged into 1 hour of content. The genre changes are frequent and jarring, and as people put it, if you're listening to a Mr. Bungle song and you don't like it, wait 20 seconds and the song will change. Multiple times throughout songs they'll change the tempo, the genre, production style, time signature, or key because, well, they felt like it. Besides the styles, the actual playing is on point. The drumming on hi-hats is perfectly timed, the guitar of Trace Spruance is distorted and metal, but it still manages to fit. Mike Patton's vocals go from high highs to low lows as he croons and screams and belts out melodies throughout the album. And special props go to Trevor Dunn's just fabulous bass lines. Thematically, this album is dark and sardonic, with tracks about mocking porn and drug addiction, laughing at absurdly horrific concepts, from concepts like Trevor Spruance's slowly dying dog, to someone who can only smell and not see, taste, hear, or touch, to an entire song dedicated to making innuendos based only on food. It's surprising a label like Warner Brothers even allowed these tracks to happen and be published on their label, but the band really didn't think the Warner executives would even listen to the album they submitted. They even considered just submitting an album of nothing but white noise at some point. A lot of the songs on this album are written as these caricatures of the people who are freaks, who are secretly dirty inside, who are just the type of person that Mr. Bungle is named after. Well, except they aren't naughty children that don't wash their hands. It feels like the band purposefully wrote about these topics, not just because they found them darkly humorous, but to be able to shove these grotesque skeletons in our closets out and point and laugh at them. You can see this sort of idea develop in their demos as well, pointing and making fun of anything they could with the childish nature of high schoolers. This entire album is a goldmine of amazing moments and experimentation, and I love it all. And so did a lot of people, with everyone from Korn to Avenged Sevenfold citing this album as a heavy influence on them.
What's your favorite album and why? Oh man, I like weird stuff. Mr. Bungle is one of my favorite bands of all time, and I think their self-titled record, their debut record, self-titled, is one of the most incredible pieces of music.
Mr. Bungle set out to make something no one else had before, and they had succeeded very well. But what would they do next? Well, first Mr. Bungle did a North American tour in support of the album, where they established their more than peculiar live shows. For one, they'd all perform in a variety of costumes and masks, from Lisa Simpson to ape costumes. Secondly, the onstage antics of Mike Patton made it infinitely weirder. He'd fling himself around the stage, he'd touch and interact with the other band members, and at one point even did an enema and burst the fluids out into the crowd. Please don't look that up. They also performed a variety of weird cover songs throughout their live show history, with everything from Star Wars to even Billy Squier covers.
I said, don't bother me, old man. The puppies. I'll stab
After that, the band took a little bit of a break, and the members went back to their own projects, with Mike Patton going back to Faith No More, released a follow-up to The Real Thing, Angel Dust, and then going back on tour. It was only until 1995, 4 years after the first album, that they came back in the studio to work on their next project. And the project was much more ambitious. The goal was to create something completely original, with a sonic soundscape of the likes that no one had ever even heard before. And they spent hours upon days in the studio laying it all out. And the album they created is, well, they certainly achieved their goal. If their first album is this walking Frankenstein's monster of genres, then Disco Volante is diving into the deep and vast ocean of music. And as you go deeper and deeper, the pressure becomes more and more worrying, as you start to feel like you're being choked by the water. The light thins and you sink into the dark, and your last thoughts are gone before nothing. Yeah, it's weird. The technical skill is way more prominent. The genre changes are so rampant that it's hard to tell when a song ends and starts. The lyrics are sparse and even darker than before. I have referred to Disco Volante as our identity crisis album. I still remember Danny, Trey, and I getting together for the first time after the '92 tour. We sat there in our rehearsal studio with our instruments staring at each other with no idea what to do. Mr. Bungle wanted to create something so out of left field, leaving people with questions of how this music was recorded, made, and even released. And by forcing themselves to work wee hours in the studio for a month on end, they got there. This album is hard to listen to. It's like a David Lynch film put into audio. It's an entirely new sound, blending jazz and metal, techno, ambient, avant-garde, and just pure noise together into this horror of an album. And that's exactly why it's a masterpiece. It's something that has never ever been replicated. It's something so out of the ordinary and bizarre that I don't think anyone will ever be able to match it again. The music for it, at first glance, seems stupid and improvisational, but in reality it's all been carefully fine-tuned to sound the exact way it did, with only a few moments on the album being true improvisation in the studio. Songs on here are hard to pinpoint into one specific theme. Some are loud, brash, distorted, and grimy, while some are more lo-fi in their sound and horror. Overall, this album is weird, and like their first, the reaction was mixed at first, but over time it gained a cult following of sorts, and a lot of praise and exposure. After that, they embarked on their first world tour. Though Theo left the band due to creative differences in 1996, Mr. Bungle came back to the studio to record a covers album that sort of fell apart in 1997. The live show antics obviously continued. It was only in 1998 that the members of Mr. Bungle came back into the studio, 3 years after Disco Volante, that they began recording new material. They decided to make it a little bit harder on themselves by recording it all on analog tape, and they stretched their budget dry. But they got it done, and this album would be considered their best. California, Mr. Bungle's third studio album, opens with the sweet sound of the ocean, a paradise typical of the place considered as utopian as California. The album ends with the sound of distortion, screaming, and then it stops. And through this transformation, it takes you through this polished and shiny, but rough and coarse series of storms and sunshine, and it's amazing. This album is Mr. Bungle at their most accessible. There's a lot more inspiration from 60s harmonies and rockers. The lyrics are all the more cryptic, but all the less dark and satirical. There's room for it to breathe, compared to the tight and suffocating sound of Disco Volante. It has its fair share of genre splicings and experimentation, but it's nowhere as in your face. It's Mr. Bungle at their poppiest, and still they manage to experiment and make it sound good. I think that each of the three albums has its own personality, and I don't mean to create some sort of hierarchy with them. The first record is the result of irreverent youth. The second represents a sort of identity crisis associated with growing pains and self-reflection. For me, California is the culmination of a lot of individual and collective thought and a deeper understanding of orchestration and song form. California is good. Some argue it's the best of these three amazing albums, and there's no reason why it can't be considered that way. It's gorgeous. These lush guitar tones and vocals fill the album with this amazing life that makes you feel so home, like you're at paradise. But don't let this feeling of comfort stay with you. This album does not hold any punches. It will surprise you with fast-paced experiments and music, speaking of suburban nightmares, where everything you know has been replaced by technology, and the world you live in is actually a secret hell. Despite how I've described it, this album isn't a conceptual album at all. Each song stands out by itself as its own little world, a little glimpse into another reality, some chaotic and some worse than others. But despite that, the album feels whole. As Danny Heifetz put it, more than anything, that title really sums up sonically what's going on the record. It's very pleasant at times, and then there are lots of little disasters that come up and present themselves, then blow over and go away like a storm. I would tend to explain it more like that, rather than, oh, California is this really deceptive place. It's bright on the outside and a really dark place on the inside. I mean, let's let the Chili Peppers do that. Coincidentally, the Red Hot Chili Peppers too had released an album within a similar time frame, also having a title bearing a striking similarity to the name of California. In fact, Mr. Bungle were planning to release their California the same day as Red Hot Chili Peppers. This is due to a rivalry between the two respective frontmen, one being Mike Patton and the other being Anthony Kiedis, the frontman of Red Hot Chili Peppers. They'd both been in an ongoing feud with each other ever since Faith No More got big off their song Epic, which Anthony Kiedis claimed ripped off their style. But things remained silent about this rivalry until now. Reportedly, Kiedis, over this release date feud, got Mr. Bungle removed from the lineup of some very big summer festivals they were also playing at, threatening to quit and lose Warner Brothers a lot of money if they didn't remove them. And considering Red Hot Chili Peppers are making a lot of money for Warner Brothers, they sided with Kiedis. It also doesn't help that Warner Brothers were still waiting on Mr. Bungle to give them Faith No More types of success. In response, while on tour to promote California, on Halloween performing at Red Hot Chili Peppers' home state of Michigan, Mr. Bungle came out dressed as Red Hot Chili Peppers and performed a medley of their hits, all the while pretending to shoot up on heroin and making comments that made fun of Red Hot Chili Peppers. This resulted in more anger on Kiedis' end. I would not have given two fucks if they played there with us, but after I heard about the Halloween show where they mocked us, fuck him and fuck the whole band. Mr. Bungle were then removed from a bunch of other festival dates, and this would have been fine, however. The band were running low on money. As Trevor puts it, everything you've heard about the Red Hot Chili Peppers screwing us is true. I'm not sure why they did it other than a non-singer's jealousy. They kept us off of festivals in Europe, Big Day Out in Australia, and they had the release date of our record postponed while they released California Harbor on. Ultimately, they screwed me out of a lot of money, for which I will forever harbor anger. The best part is that they had full support from their record label. And the fact is, Warner did side with the Red Hot Chili Peppers in the end, and that left Mr. Bungle miserable. It didn't help that they went on the Snowcore tour in 2000, a festival for alternative rock and metal acts. They were frequently booed by the audience for not playing the same style of music that System of a Down and Incubus were playing, which resulted in even lower morale from the group. This inevitably caused the group to fold, and they did not come back. For a long while. But they did come back eventually, first with some shows, and recently in 2020, a re-recording of their first demo, The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny. But I won't talk about that here, as it isn't really considered part of their essential trilogy. It's alright though. What they left in the music sphere during the 90s is quite interesting. A run of 3 albums, all completely different from each other in style, genre, sonic soundscape, and overall aesthetic that left a well-defined mark on the wall, a scorch of talent that we may never be able to witness again. If only people appreciated them more for what they were, because it's unlikely there will ever be a run of albums, or a band, like Mr. Bungle, ever again.